Did you know that parents rank teaching financial literacy as the toughest life skill? That's where Greenlight comes in, the debit card and money app made for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and track spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn how to earn, save, and spend responsibly, while parents have peace of mind knowing smart money habits are being built with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery. That's greenlight.com/Wondery.
Parles-tu français? Hablas español? Parli italiano? If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Wondery. Spelled BABBEL.com/Wondery. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm Brett, and I am not joined with Alice today. She had to work, but don't turn off the recording yet, because I am not alone. Thank goodness for everyone. I am joined with Ben Johnson, and we are going to have an awesome discussion about the United States Marshals, their history, a new museum focusing on that, and some of the cool cases they have worked on before. So, Mr. Johnson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir, very much. Good to be here.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us. When you guys reached out and started talking about this, I mean, basically, you mentioned the U.S. Marshals, and that was it. I was done. I was ready to do it because I love the U.S. Marshals. It's an awesome group of people. We've had FBI agents on. We've had ATF agents on, and don't tell them I said this, but the U.S. Marshals are my favorite, not least of which because one of the things they do is keep us safe in the courtroom. So, you know, I have like a personal interest in liking them. But thank you so much for coming on. I do want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to everyone who's listening.
Sure. So since August of 2022, I have served as the president and CEO of the Marshals Service's one and only National Museum dedicated to their now 236 years of history. I'm not a deputy, never wore a badge, don't carry a gun to work most days. I'm a geek. I've been doing this for a long time, been in the museum business since about 2003. And, you know, really, I got into it because I didn't want to write another paper in college. So I had an opportunity to go in and do an internship at a museum, and I didn't get paid anything, but I could go sit in an old airplane anytime I wanted. And I got to hang out with cool people who had great life experience. And for me, it was a bit of a dream come true. I mean, it was all the stuff that I enjoyed doing and reading about anyway. I just got to do it for college credit. And like a lot of nonprofits, you hang around long enough, eventually they're going to start paying you to be there. So I did. I got a little bit of money, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And, you know, I really just became fascinated with it. It's a weird business. It is a fun business most of the time. And I've just been blessed that from all the folks that I did my undergrad and graduate school with, you know, there's very few of us that actually make a living doing history of any meaningful sort. You know, a lot become lawyers like you, a lot sell insurance or go into law enforcement or banking or whatever. So the fact that, you know, I'm 25 almost years later and I actually get a paycheck for doing this, it makes my mom incredibly happy.
Yeah, I was a history major, and I figured it was either starve or be a lawyer. I didn't realize there was a third option. But no, that's really cool in of itself.
Yeah, I didn't either. I mean, this was totally, people ask, like, how did you get into this? Or like, I was just I was a double major and I didn't want to write another paper. And they said, well, for this degree, you can go do an internship. And I never even considered it, honestly. I mean, it wasn't something that I planned to do. I just, have an aptitude for it. And if you love history and you love, everything, if you love going to museums when you're on vacation, being able to go to work in one every day, there are still the challenges of running a business and all that sort of stuff. But being able to walk out in the gallery and see, little kids to grandmas and grandpas reading the stuff that you have on the wall and enjoying what you're doing and having fun and learning. I mean, it's incredibly rewarding. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the Marshall Museum at some point, but I'm actually really interested in just the museum thing in
Yeah.
general and sort of doing that kind of work. I mean, it's one of those things that I feel like everybody knows there are people who run museums. I don't think a lot of people think that would be a really cool job, but as you said, like no one knows how you even get into that. And there have to be you said it's like running a business, and I can imagine the funding issues and all that's very difficult. What is your role as far as curator of the museum? I mean, because I got to imagine you're doing something like the Marshals Museum. There's so many things that you could put in there. There's unlimited things and limited space. So is that something you are involved in? Is that a specific role that someone else has? How does that work?
Yeah, I have done that. So I basically over the 20 years, I started as the lowest possible role that you could do, where it was I cleaned bathrooms, I emptied trash, I moved stuff all over. I did get to do curatorial work for a good amount of time in collections management. That is a role. I mean, that is a very specialized skill set for a lot of museums is you have somebody in the curator or in large museums, you've got a whole bunch of them who spend their days basically being able to focus on being subject matter experts. So read all the stuff and understand it all and take, depending on the size of the institution, you've got different levels, more money, more staff. Obviously, everyone can specialize. At the Marshals Museum, we have a relatively small staff. So our curator, David Kennedy, who's been doing this, I think he might have just had either his 9th or 10th anniversary with the Marshals Museum. He's the go-to guy. So you call up and ask a question, or, I'm out giving a talk about something and somebody goes, well, tell me about this one specific event and wants granular detail. I'm the first to go, Dave's your guy. He's the curator. He knows all of the ins and outs of all of this. And so from my role, over the last couple of decades, I've, you grow up in a career and then eventually, you start because you like old airplanes and history stuff. And, eventually you're sitting in meetings talking about open enrollment periods for insurance coverage and why the boiler needs to be inspected again. And, so I don't get to do as much of that anymore as I really want to do. Every once in a while, because we're a relatively small staff, I get to geek out a little bit and join the team and help with an exhibit or do some graphics or do something like that, or go on a podcast and talk about what we do. But really, it's a uniquely interesting industry if you want to do a whole bunch of different things. And we are part event venue, we are part tourist attraction, part retail shop, part coffee shop. So we have to have folks who are interested and have intellectual capacities and professional experience in all of these different areas. And you can go to school to get a museum studies degree. A lot of people just kind of fall into it backwards and you just end up here. But yeah, it's fun.
Hands-on training is probably better than the school can offer.
Well, you make a lot more mistakes, that's for sure. And, you learn your limitations and you learn that you are not God's gift to everything, because I learned everything by doing, not because I got taught to do it.
Well, frankly, I think that's the only way you learn much of anything. But
Yeah.
okay, so as you said, you started off at an aerospace museum in Nebraska. It's almost like you're in the military as much as you moved around. You're in Oregon, you're in New York, you're in Iowa, and now you have found yourself in Fort Smith, Arkansas, whereas the United States Marshals Museum is located. How did you end up doing this particular job?
Yeah, so I have bounced around. I have a very patient wife with a flexible remote job, and so she allowed me to follow my passion in a way that I think a lot of people probably wouldn't. And this is an odd business, like any kind of niche industry. If you want to go up the ladder in a moderately quick pace, you got to be willing to move. And so we got married, and 6 months later, I'd said, let's move to Oregon. We never been, we haven't been there. Let's just move there. And then we did that. And okay, well, I'm ready for the next big challenge. So let's move to New York State, and did that. And after COVID, we wanted to get back toward the middle of the country to be a little bit closer to family, being a couple of days away. If something bad happened, and we needed to get in the car. New York from where we lived to the middle of the country was almost 2 full days in the car. So we moved back into the Midwest, and I got a call from a headhunter one day, a recruiter. Headhunter is probably not the right word, but recruiter, and said, we have this cool opportunity and we're trying to find the next CEO. The museum wasn't open yet. It had a kind of a exceedingly long, protracted development process from going all the way back to 2007. And by this point, it was 2022, and it still hadn't opened yet. And I got on Google just like anybody else and tried to learn as much as I could. And it had some of its challenges, but the more that I learned about the Marshal Service and the more folks that I got to talk to, it wasn't about Fort Smith or even Arkansas. This was truly a national and international story. And as you know firsthand, the men and women of the Marshal Service are the unsung heroes of the federal judicial system. They've been around the longest, and people probably know the least about them than any of the agencies that are out there. So I moved down here in August of 2022. I don't recommend moving to the Mid-South in August. It's like living on the surface of the sun, and not ideal. But we got down here, and I've just fallen in love with beating the drum and telling their story, because they don't want the attention. The men and women of the Marshal Service for 236 years have kind of flown under the radar for the most part. And they don't want the attention, and they don't want some of the complexity that goes with it. And so for us, being an independent nonprofit that is, we operate with the Marshal Service, but we're not a part of the federal bureaucracy. We got to tell their story and pat them on the back. And, I can come on a podcast and talk about them, and I don't, need the Department of Justice to approve that it's okay. So,
which I appreciated, because it was nice not having to jump through those hoops, which we had to do when we talked to the FBI and talked to ATF. It was just, we had to have somebody there to make sure we didn't say the wrong thing. You had to jump through all the hoops, get all the approvals. It took 6 months. I mean, we talked to you last week. And here you are. Yeah. And I tell you what, the other advantage is, like, if you want to go to the FBI museum, you basically have to get like an invitation from the president, because it's at the headquarters. Whereas you're wide open to everybody.
Post 9/11, that was one of the things that the Marshal Service had in mind when they were going into the kind of redevelopment period of identifying where they wanted their museum to be, was, when the FBI museum is at the Hoover building, post 9/11, you're not just going to let it open and have anybody be able to wander in at any moment. And, I've been there, but yeah, we needed special invitation. I think the public can go. It's just, you got to call ahead and really, like you said, jump through the hoops. Where for us, you just come to Fort Smith and park and walk 50 feet and you're in our front door. And, that has positives and negatives. But for the vast majority of us, we got 10, 20 calls a day during the government shutdown saying, are you guys open? Yeah, man. Come on in. Right. We're not part of the federal government. We work with the federal government. We don't get any money from them, for good or ill. But it's a unique arrangement from a business standpoint and from a historical standpoint. But you wouldn't have been able, the Marshal Service can't come to the Marshals Museum and talk about some stuff.
Right.
Because it's just an overly litigious society. And I understand it. I mean, anybody within federal law enforcement, is a target in a lot of different ways. And especially, one person says the wrong thing, that ends up in a courtroom somewhere, and that's no good. But luckily for me, I'm just a geek that can read as much as I can and come and talk about it.
So as you said, the Marshals have been around for 236 years. They didn't get a museum until 2023. I think most people, when they think of the U.S. Marshals, they either think of Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive, or they think of Raylan Givens on Justified, right? Did the Marshals shoot as many people as Raylan Givens shot? It seems like he was shooting somebody every day.
We were talking about that the other day in the office. That came up, and we're like, if any of the deputies that we know shot somebody, on every case, they probably would not have very long careers. That wouldn't work. But, if you were to do what they actually do every single day, it'd be not an ideal television show all the time.
Which is true, I think, of like, I mean, that's the thing. Everybody who's ever had a television show made about their profession knows it is not that sexy. So let's talk about the U.S. Marshals a little bit. Can you give sort of our listeners an overview of what they do, what their role is, what their chief job is in the judiciary?
We've all set health goals: lose weight, exercise more, eat better. But without a plan, they often fade. That's where Prolong comes in. Its 5-day fasting mimicking diet gives you a science-backed, structured approach to stay on track and see real results. Prolong offers an injection-free way to lose weight and burn fat while protecting lean muscle and maintain results. In just 5 days, it activates fasting pathways to support metabolic health and rejuvenate cells, all while letting you enjoy real food. Prolon is a plant-based nutrition program featuring soups, snacks, and beverages designed to nourish the body while keeping it in a fasting state, triggering cellular rejuvenation and renewal. It was developed over decades at USC's Longevity Institute and backed by top U.S. medical centers. Prolong has been shown to support biological age reduction, metabolic health, skin appearance, fat loss, and energy. NextGen builds on the original Prolong with 100% organic soups and teas, a richer taste, and ready-to-eat meals. You guys have heard me talk about it. I don't know that I have the willpower to fast completely with no food. That's where Prolong makes fasting mimicking a possibility for me. And no matter the reason, when I'm craving a real reset, Prolong is the only nutrition program that works for me. It's convenient, backed by Nobel-winning science, and it works. For a limited time, Prolong is offering listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's prolonlife.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors. This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit Progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
Like you said, most folks are either thinking Tommy Lee Jones, or my other end of that spectrum is the Old West. They think of the
Marshall
Old West.
Dillon.
Yeah, right. And so for us, a lot of what we what we really have to battle is folks that think we're a Wild West museum. It's going to be all guns and saddles and whatever. Well, the Office of the Marshal goes back to the very founding of the country, and especially for federal law enforcement. In some circles of this country, people talk about the jackbooted thugs who are not constitutionally mandated and blah blah blah. Well, the Marshal Service was created. It wasn't a service yet. The office of the United States Marshal was created within the Constitution in 1789. They created the office of the Marshal as the enforcement arm of the federal judiciary when they migrated from, the initial Articles of Confederation, the initial attempt at creating a centralized federal government that was so dang loose. That was a whole bunch of mostly independent states that were loosely tied together. You had this federal system where, how do you enforce something? How do you get people to follow federal law in whatever form it is if there's no enforcement avenue at all? So when the founders went back and kind of gave it, what's plan B? Let's go back and try this again, and created what we now know as the Constitution of the United States. One of the very critical first things was the Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the federal judiciary. So as much as we who aren't in the federal government, or just kind of lay people who complain about the court system and nothing ever works and whatever. Well, for 236 years, the court system has functioned at a more or less a very high rate for how it was constructed. And so the office of the Marshal within the Judiciary Act, every judicial district within the United States has a marshal that is a presidentially appointed position that is confirmed by the Senate, and that operating underneath the marshal are varying degrees of kind of, the deputy marshal is the most current, but there were posse members obviously going back into the Old West, special deputies, now task force officers, court security officers. So you have this kind of infrastructure there so that if a court were to subpoena somebody, provide a court order and need enforcement, the Marshal Service are the ones who are delivering a lot of these documents. And this is kind of inside baseball, but this is the prosecutor's podcast, so you guys probably enjoy it more than the standard Rotary Club lunch that I would go to. But the ability to have men and women who go out there and serve paperwork and enforce the law. Now, a lot of that has expanded. Although, as they've evolved over 236 years, those core functions of judicial security and being the enforcement arm of the federal government is still critical. So as you said, they're responsible for protecting federal property and courthouses and whatnot. They protect federal judges, prosecutors, to ensure that you can't have a functioning judicial system if judges, prosecutors, and witnesses are intimidated or killed, or impacted in any way from the outside through threats of violence. And so the Marshal Service has been great over 236 years as they've evolved. Now, before, every judicial district was kind of semi-autonomous. They kind of had their own deal. The Marshal had a lot more discretion. And it wasn't until the 20th century where they really merged into first a bureau and then an agency within the federal government, where there's more of a centralized control and they're more of a unified command structure. Although there is a director of the Marshal Service and it's more combined, they do still have, the marshals of every district are still presidentially appointed and serve at the pleasure of the president. And so at any given moment, there's folks coming in and folks going out. And it's a lot like the U.S. attorney world, where just because you are now, the new administration comes in, you may not be. But as I say, the door kickers, the men and women who are out there doing the real work, doing the investigative stuff and the courthouse security and all of the other, various duties, witness security, the witness protection program, as Hollywood has kind of deemed it.
Which most people think the FBI does. They don't realize it's actually the marshals who do the whole witness protection thing.
And I think that goes back to Hollywood. I mean, I genuinely think that a lot of that is because in the early days of the program, and I'd love to come onto a podcast and talk about the witness security program, but there's nothing to say because there's very little in the museum because they won't tell us anything. They won't tell us anything. So, I would love to, what is what I know is publicly available. It's from Goodfellas and
right.
Books like that, or whatever. So anyway, that's a little off topic, but the Marshal Service is really up into the 21st century. They're responsible for all federal prisoner management. So anybody who's in federal prison or within that process is the responsibility of the Marshal Service. They are responsible for judicial security, as we already talked about. They run the witness security program, which...
Let's not forget the fugitives.
Well, yeah,
It's the movie name. I mean,
that's the one where I end on of my list of what they do. Before the fugitive apprehension part, they are also responsible for all of the civil asset forfeiture on behalf of the federal government. So, you guys as prosecutors are going after somebody. Bernie Madoff is the kind of one, although that's even a dated reference anymore. But you get somebody who potentially has the benefits of ill-gotten gains through criminal enterprise, and while they're going through the court process, as their assets are frozen, the Marshal Service is responsible for managing it and having possession of it. And then if they get convicted, if they get acquitted, obviously they get to keep their stuff. But if they get convicted, the Marshal Service is responsible for liquidating it and returning it to victims or other anti-crime programs. But the fun part is the fugitive apprehension part. The marshals really are the foremost fugitive hunting group, I think, in the world. I mean, there may be some secret ones out there that nobody knows about, but in the 70s, the federal government basically transitioned. You've got the FBI and the ATF and the DEA and the Marshals Service and all. The Postal Service has a law enforcement arm, and there's a whole bunch of others. Department of Energy has some. There's all these different varying degrees of intersecting law enforcement from a federal level, and the Marshal Service is responsible for the most part with fugitive apprehension. So they're not doing as much of the investigative work, but DEA has a list of bad guys, or FBI or ATF or whatever, and they say, here's what we got, go get them, because we need to bring them to justice. And that's the famous line that is in The Fugitive, where they're in the tunnel and the water's coming down, and he's saying, Harrison Ford saying, I didn't kill my wife, and Tommy Lee Jones says, I don't care, because that's not his goal. It's not his job is to track down the fugitive and bring him back to face justice. His job is not to determine guilt or innocence. So,
of course, he does in the end, because
it's a movie. Hollywood. But, these guys are really, inside our Modern Marshals gallery, we have a live top 15 most wanted fugitives list, and it turns over pretty regularly. And the more that I started to learn, I admit I was no different than anybody else. All I knew about the Marshal Service was The Fugitive and, Goodfellas, from the perspective of witness security. But they do so much from the local task forces and fugitive apprehensions all around the world. I've just within the last year realized that they had teams in South America that were hunting Nazis in the 70s and 80s. They're doing all this stuff that nobody knows about, and it really is a remarkable group of men and women that to do what they do. And my job stinks some days, just like anybody else's, but no one's just shooting at me.
Right.
I'm not trying to kick down somebody's door and arrest crazy drug fugitive or child sex predators or drugs or guns or whatever. So these guys are they're absolutely amazing.
And they're really good at it. I mean, I can say this from experience. Don't tell the FBI and the ATF I said this. But a lot of times, the ATF will be trying to find somebody and weeks will pass. And it's like, maybe you should just let the marshals do it. And they're like, no, we got it. We're going to get them. And then a few more weeks pass. And then finally like, okay, fine. We'll turn it over to the marshals. And then like the next day, the guy gets arrested. they're just so good at it.
They have honed this specific skill for so long. And they have been at the forefront of the technology and the tactics necessary to identify not only who the bad guy is, but where they are, what their network looks like, how do you find them and cuff them up faster than almost anyone else. And I think a lot of that is a testament to their unique focus on the job at hand and just that unreal determination that this person, whoever it is, will not get away. They will be brought to face justice. And, the very few on our wall that are long-term, like decades-long fugitives from justice, I don't think there's any way most of those people are still alive. Because you're not going to be alive for 30 years with the Marshal Service hunting for you. It's just it's just not going to happen.
So we've talked about how a lot of people don't know much about the Marshals except what they've seen in a few movies and television shows. You're charged with telling that story. You're charged with educating people as to what they do. So how is the museum sort of designed to do that?
So to answer that, we got to go just back up just a little bit because you did say, we always used to say the oldest federal law enforcement agency. We've started being more mindful to say the first federal law enforcement agency. And so for a couple hundred years, they got to look at some of their federal brothers and sisters that had museums. The FBI, the ATF, DEA, a lot of these, there's museums out there. And so in the 70s, there was a museum of sorts at a facility in Wyoming that didn't get run real well, and they weren't super happy with it. In the 80s and 90s, that evolved into a traveling exhibit that went around the country through the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibit Service, which was really significantly well done. But, you drive it around the country for a decade, it's going to get beat up and dated and whatever. And so then that went away. And then they started thinking, we need our own place. And for us, the city of Fort Smith, the first question I get when people talk about the Marshals Service Museum is, why the hell is it in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and not in Washington, D.C. or Virginia or New York City or, one of these kind of more conventional locations for a museum? And for us, that's a relatively easy question to answer because we have, one, the community really rolled out the red carpet and they wanted it. But the reason that they wanted it and the reason that this community is uniquely well suited to house this museum from a historical perspective is we have one of the primary rooms, the most important room in the entire building is the Hall of Honor. And the Hall of Honor on the wall has the names of 393 men and women who've been killed in the line of duty since 1789. Of those 393, 122 of them were killed while serving out of the federal court in the Western District of Arkansas in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So
that seems high.
Most of that was the 19th century. So, you go back and, for us, we are right on the banks of the Arkansas River. So we look out and, across the rivers, Oklahoma. Back in the day, that was Indian territory when the federal government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to uproot tribal citizens in the eastern part of the country because they wanted the land. They moved them all out west to some of the worst land in North America at the time. Oklahoma was beautiful. Don't come
we
for
all
me.
love Oklahoma.
Yeah, we all love Oklahoma. Don't come for me. But they moved all of them into Indian territory, and so most U.S. territories, as the frontier moved westward, had their own territorial court system. Again, this is more inside baseball for you guys, but there was no territorial court system within Indian territory. So everything that happened there that involved the United States of America would end up being adjudicated in Fort Smith. So the Wild West really was wild because you had these folks that when they did something bad and they wanted to escape the long arm of the law, they would hightail it across the river and go into Indian territory and try to just disappear. So the 122 was you get posse or an individual like Bass Reeves, who often went out by himself, which is somebody that I didn't know at all before coming here, who would just ride off into Indian territory and bring back the bad guy. So it was an incredibly dangerous time. So Fort Smith isn't like the craziest, most dangerous city in the world right now. So fast forward up to 2007, the Marshal Service selected Fort Smith as the home of its museum. It takes a long time to raise $50 million in a town of 100,000 people. If you're not prepared for that, I wouldn't recommend trying to do it. It's just not great. So by the time, I got in and we finished the galleries and opened, there had been 15 plus years of work of what do we want this to be? How do we tell this big story in a relatively finite amount of space? And so I played a very small part in kind of the final development of the exhibit galleries. The biggest part I played was raising the last $5 or $6 million to finish it and convincing some people that this was worthy of finishing and trying to figure that out. But the team really created what is a unique, to me, I'm a geek and I've been to a lot of museums all over the place. This is one of the most uniquely well done American history museums in the country. And we're not an Old West. We're not law enforcement. Strictly speaking, it's an American history museum that's told through the lens of the United States Marshals Service. So we have our permanent galleries, 20,000 square feet, 5 primary gallery spaces that tell 236 years of history. And even if, for the folks listening, you try to think about your own life story, how would you tell your own life story? You can't tell everything that's ever happened to you. One, it'd be too dang long, and there'd be a lot of chunks that are boring, and people just wouldn't be interested. So you had to make some serious decisions about how do you tell this complicated story in a way that is entertaining and engaging. And if people learn something by accident, great. When we were kids, you go to the museum on a field trip, it was shut up, stand in line, put your hands in your pockets, don't touch anything, don't have any fun, and look at old pictures on the wall. And so 21st century museum, that doesn't cut it. You got to be interactive, you have to be immersive and engaging, and give kids or adults who are childlike, like my wife, who likes pushing all the buttons and opening the things, and and really, you can't just go into museums and just pick stuff up. Don't pick stuff up. So we have 5 kind of basic galleries. We begin with the Constitution. The American experiment begins and ends with the Constitution of the United States. And for good or ill, it is the most singularly impactful and important political document in human history, in my opinion. And for those who are interested in, understanding the evolution of the United States, and really for global history, there weren't a lot of representative democratic republics that lasted very long prior to the Constitution of the United States. It just didn't happen. Greece tried it a little bit. Rome had some luck for a very brief period of time. There were some outliers here and there, but really, when you look at it, this is the foundational thing for Western democracy. And for the Marshal Service, they were critical in wanting to say, we don't want to be shown as being the white hats all the time. We're not just coming in to save the day for 236 years. Their story, and this was a more recent quote, and I don't know exactly where it came from. I heard it from our curator. Whether he made it up, I don't know. But the Marshals, they may not have always been on the right side of history as we look back on it, but they've always been on the right side of the law as it existed at that time. So within about 15 feet, we tell the story about the Marshal Service is responsible for enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s. And then by the time you get to the 1870s, you have former slave, abolitionist, orator Frederick Douglass being appointed as the first Black United States Marshal by, I think, Rutherford B. Hayes.
Huh. I didn't know that.
I didn't either until we hung it on the wall.
Yeah.
And so, it is a very cool thing to be able to tell that story. So the initial gallery talks about the Constitution, begins there, is a very high level timeline, and goes through some of the various areas of responsibility. We got some cool artifacts in there. We do talk about the frontier. You can't not talk about the frontier when you're talking about the Marshal Service and American history. So we delve into, like, what does it mean? What does the frontier mean? And, what does it look like as the United States expanded from, the northeast or eastern seaboard westward across the continent, and how that affected the Marshal Service, how that affected the United States citizenry, how it affected the tribal citizens that lived on the land prior to the United States and continue to live in various capacities when they were allowed to. And that kind of the tug between freedom and slavery, law and lawlessness, and how that evolves. We've had some supreme luck talking about, some critical aspects of how the United States had engaged with the tribal citizens, the Intertribal Council. The 5 tribes of Oklahoma have a sitting member on our board, and so we're just very mindful and respectful there. But we also got to talk about the fun stuff. I mean, you can't talk about the Old West without a dang saloon, so we built one. So we got a saloon in the gallery where you can go through the swinging doors. We've got a parade saddle owned by John Wayne. We've got an original 19th century bar. It's got a digital bartender that talks to you and tells stories. A poker table trivia game with outlaws and lawmen, and being able to go through that is really fun. That's where I lose kids on the tour. When I go through there, then they end up staying in there and having fun. We have a campfire scene, which is a really kind of a uniquely interesting concept, where we have 4 life-size figures that represent the 4 centuries of the Marshal Service. They're men and women, they're black and white, and they're telling stories, and they have nothing in common except for the fact that they've all worn the badge and done a similar job. So they're talking and telling stories, and most of them are, pretty serious, but we do talk about, The Tiger King gets a mention because the Marshal Service was related with the Tiger King's fiasco over in Oklahoma. And then we bring up to the modern day where we talk about the 20th century from everything from social disruptors, anti-war protests or rail strikes or the American Indian movement, different sorts of natural disasters and, 9/11 and, that all the way up through pushing the boundaries of what is the proper role of federal authority. Is it big power federal or is it no or limited power federal? So we talk beginning at the Whiskey Rebellion and Prohibition. Not a lot of people are emotional about either of those subjects anymore. But we do then go up and talk about some of the serious, the Medina incident where a handful of deputies and sheriff's officers were killed. We talk about Ruby Ridge. We don't run from it. The Marshal Service was involved in the Ruby Ridge incident. Well, it wasn't just one incident, and that whole scenario. We talk about Oklahoma City, and so that from a museum standpoint, any of the efforts that we've had that have been complained about or where the few threats that we've received have been about that gallery where we talk about the proper role and the use of federal force. And we go into the modern era. Well, before the modern era, civil rights era, we have a huge portion on the civil rights movement and the role of the Marshal Service and how
Talk a little bit about that, because I think people don't realize that the Marshal Service had anything to do with that.
So going back into the 50s, the Marshal Service being the enforcement arm of the federal judiciary, this was an incredibly tumultuous period in American history. I think everybody knows, but unless you live through it, I'm young enough that I didn't live through it. So, I wasn't there watching the marches and doing all that kind of stuff. So what I know has come through other people. But as we today have all of these social movements going on where you have this big group of people that thinks the country should go one way and this other big group of people thinks it should either stay or go another way, I think it's only a fraction of the intensity of what was experienced going back into the late 19th and early 20th century. And so the Marshal Service, when the federal government started talking about the forcible integration of society, particularly across the South, the Marshal Service was involved almost from day one because the courts were the ones that were adjudicating a lot of these cases, Brown versus Board of Education and others, Plessy versus Ferguson, where you see this monumental shift in how the federal government from a judicial standpoint is looking at race relations and integration and desegregation. And so as the enforcement arm of the federal judiciary, the Marshal Service was there on the ground from the very beginning because they were the ones tasked in large part to keep the warring sides from killing each other, as the court was moving its way through. But also when an enforcement action was necessary, if a court order was handed down, who are you going to call to enforce it? And so it goes back a little bit farther, but the Marshal Service, the one story we don't talk about is the Little Rock Nine, the 9 students who integrated Little Rock Central High School, primarily because the Marshal Service was in Little Rock in the late 1950s, trying to come up with a way, how do we do this in a safe manner? How do we integrate the schools and allow these black students to go to the previously segregated high school and do it in a way that provides for the safety and security of everybody involved, including the protesters but primarily the students and the faculty. But, their goal is not to just beat everybody who's protesting into submission and forcibly push these kids in. They're trying to just allow the freedom of speech, the freedom to protest. You can do whatever, but allow the kids to also be in there. Well, that particular plan that they had created didn't end up actually getting into fruition, primarily because the governor of Arkansas at the time closed the schools, brought out the National Guard, did a bunch, and
that's when Eisenhower had to
eventually
the National Guard, right?
Eisenhower ended up sending in the 101st Airborne basically to integrate them. But the Marshal Service took what they had put in place and what they learned from being on the ground at Little Rock and evaluating all of the possible repercussions and how do we do this. They took that down to New Orleans in 1960. And in November 1960, there were 4 little girls who were the first to integrate the New Orleans public school system in November of 1960. And the Marshal Service was responsible for escorting these little girls to and from school every single day, to provide security to the school, to provide security outside of school hours. And so, as a history geek in 2024 in March, I had what I call a top 5 day. We had 3 of these women who are now grandmothers. We had, I think they're all in, I think 70, 71 now, because they just had the 65th anniversary. One of their mothers is still alive, and the last living deputy who escorted them to school, all on stage together for a guided conversation for about 700 junior high and high school kids in Little Rock, talking about how this impacted their life. And to hear from a personal standpoint, the kids were 6, they did what mom and dad told them, but it has affected their life ever since. They're all still inextricably connected together. The 4 of them, with 3 are still living. One, Tessie, unfortunately passed last year. But to hear the stories from the Marshal Service specifically, where you had deputies, this is what we mean by they're always on the right side of the law, because you had deputies who were there who were doing their duty and doing their responsibility, who did not agree that integration or desegregation was the best course of action for the United States. But when they were tasked with a job, federal judge gives them the court order, they went out and did their job, which is what they continue to do today. So when they're in places like Memphis or DC or Portland or whatever, and you're thinking, why the heck would these people go out there and do that? They do it because it's their job, and they're following the law as it exists at the time. And so you have these men and women, well, mostly men at that time, and hearing from the mother what it was like to pass off their 6-year-old little girl to 6 foot tall white guy with a crew cut and a black suit that they'd never met before, and knowing that there's a mob out there that would likely kill their daughter if they got the chance, because they disagreed with allowing this little girl to go to school with the little white kids. The ability to just hand them off and say, protect my baby, and not knowing what would happen was just pretty remarkable. And so we talk a lot about that. We talk about James Meredith at Ole Miss, the amount of, basically, we call it the Battle of Oxford, but, it was a multi-day riot, basically, where, these armed mobs were a lot of what we see today, out in different parts of the country and around the world, where you get armed mobs that don't believe in whatever is going on. And, talking to some of the men that were there, they had spent their early career standing outside of his dorm in the middle of the night, just defending this gentleman's right to get a college education in the United States. That's the Marshal Service. And, they weren't doing it for glory. They definitely weren't doing it for pay. I mean, they were getting paid, but, none of these guys are getting rich. There were no lucrative book deals. Very few of them were optioned into movies. So, they were doing this because, it was their job. And, to talk to some of them about it and how that has continued to impact their life. Most of them now are past, or if they haven't, they're in their late 80s or 90s. But just to talk about that kind of stuff is just remarkable. And to know that, on one day they could be, going to talk to Martin Luther King and saying, Dr. King, you can't march. You can't do your thing right now. The judge says no. You got to wait. This is going through the system. But as soon as the judge, allowed it, provided a court order or whatever, they put it in their pocket, and you had 100 deputy marshals walking across the bridge into Selma, protecting the right of peaceable people to protest within the confines of a civil society. So it is a remarkable period in American history. It's a remarkable period in the Marshal Service history, and really people don't fully, we have the benefit now of looking back from history and saying, well, of course it all worked out, mostly. But in that moment, nobody knew what was going to happen. I mean, even when you get to the point where, Dr. King was killed and Bobby Kennedy, and you get, as rough as it is right now, imagine living in the mid to late 60s and all of the chaos that was going on, that these men and some women were on the front lines of it. And once we get past that, from a modern perspective, this is not exactly part of our mission statement, but we want to tell people what they do and how how do you get to be one? Do they still exist? And so, being able to tell a modern story within the capacity of, a few thousand square feet in that final gallery, we have, from an interactive perspective, we have a couple of interactive digital training simulators that it's in a room modeled after the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, where you chase a digital bad guy down the street. And, it's not just about the physical part. When you get done, you got to answer questions. What did he drop? How many other people were in the window? What color was the car that drove by? And, kids get it. Kids love it. It's so much fun walking in there and, having a group of 40 or 50 elementary school or middle school students just cheering each other on or jeering each other. I did walk in a couple of weeks ago and a couple of county sheriffs in full gear were in there running by themselves and trying to do it, which was a lot of fun. And, and then we talk about all the stuff they do around the world, and we have an oral history theater where we actively try to record history as it, the time to record stories is when people are still alive, not after the fact, after grandpa dies. And you're like, why didn't we write this story down?
Right.
So that's a long answer to your question about how you tell that story. But, this is really, it's an American story. It is the story of the American experiment through the United States Marshals Service. And it is an honor and a privilege to be able to tell the story. And also, when they walk in, when we first opened and we had 400 people show up for our VIP opening, and you had these just grizzled men that had been doing this for decades, and they're in their 70s or whatever or older, and they walk in the gallery and there's just tears, because they never thought this was going to happen. They genuinely didn't think. That's where you're like, that's why we do what we do, is to be able to go in and tell the story.
Well, Ben, I can tell you're passionate about this. I think that passion is probably reflected in the museum. I'm gonna have to get out to it myself. If you're in Fort Smith, Arkansas, if you're going through Fort Smith, Arkansas, if you live close to Fort Smith, Arkansas, if you want to take a trip to Fort Smith, Arkansas, make sure you check out the U.S. Marshals Museum. I can talk to you all night. We've already been going an hour. It's hard to believe, but this is fascinating stuff.
Check us out. It really, it is worth your time, and it is an international caliber museum. Goal for 26 and 27 is to get out in the country. We are a national museum. We want to get out in towns and cities all across the country and tell the story. But, if you want to learn more, you want to drop us $5 or $10 to help us do the story, go to marshallsmuseum.org, search Marshals Museum. We don't get any funds from any government to operate. We're all self-funded. So any help we can get, we'd greatly appreciate it. And we'd love to host any of you that are listening. You want to come down to Fort Smith and get some barbecue and hang out and learn some good stories.
Maybe we could do a live show there. That'd be fun.
Anytime. You want to come next week? We'll set it up. Well, next week's
probably a little.
We probably can't do next week. We won't do next week. But yeah, we'd be happy to do it. It'd be great.
Oh, there you go. I'm going to hold you to that. We're going to do that. All right. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us. We will put that link in the show notes. You guys should check it out. And if anybody goes to the museum, I would love to hear your experience. I'm sure Ben would love to hear it as well. We'll make sure to pass that on. And I just have to say thank you for joining the show and for bringing this to our attention. I mean, I'll tell you, I know about the U.S. Marshals. I know some of the stuff they did. I didn't realize they had a museum. So hopefully this has been something that's been enlightening for a lot of people. Like I said, if you guys have thoughts, if you've been to the museum, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. Follow us on all the social medias at prosecutorspod. Do you guys have a social media presence you want to share, or do you not do that?
Yes, we're all over Facebook. We're all over Instagram. I think it's Marshals Museum, at Marshals Museum. We don't do TikTok yet, so if you're looking for fun, dances, Marshals themed dances or whatever, we're not quite there yet. But Well, I got some 20-somethings on the team that are ready to do that at some point.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. Really appreciated it. I know you were disappointed that Alice wasn't here.
Next time.
Always is. Exactly. Next time. And guys, I promise if you're listening, we will be back next week and Alice will be there. But until then, I'm Brett, and this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. right. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody who joined. I hope you enjoyed that. You guys need to jump on that road trip. Somebody wants to know which section of the museum is your favorite. I assume it's the saloon, because, I mean, what else would be? But maybe you have a different take on that.
It's hard to not like the saloon.
Like the saloon?
Yeah, it is. But we also have the chicken suit from the Operation Flagship Sting in DC in the 80s.
Oh, with the football tickets?
Yes. So we
This November, action is free on Pluto TV. Go on the run with Jack Reacher.
Every suspect was a trained killer.
Then buckle up for Drive, World War Z,
Every human being we save is one less to fight.
and Charlie's Angels.
Damn, I hate to fly.
Launch into sci-fi adventure with The Fifth Element and laugh through the mayhem in Tropic Thunder.
What is going on here?
All the thrills, all for free. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.